What if the answers to two of life's biggest questions are more closely connected than we think? What gives life meaning? And what makes some people truly successful? In this 1-hour C1 advanced English listening practice, we will explore how purpose is built through everyday experiences and how successful people develop the mindset to overcome challenges, embrace failure, and keep moving forward. We will discover the psychology behind meaning, motivation, resilience, and personal growth while expanding our C1 level vocabulary, improving our listening skills, and learning natural English expressions for real conversations, academic writing, and IELTS speaking. So get comfortable, stay curious, and let's begin our journey together. Okay, let's unpack these.
I mean, we really have to, because this is a massive psychological terrain we're crossing today.
It is, yeah. So to give you, the listener, a clear map of what we are doing, we are structuring this exploration into two distinct phases.
Right.
First, we're going to completely dismantle this deeply ingrained, culturally pervasive myth of the success gene. We will tear down the idea that high achievers are just born with a biological advantage.
Which is such a widespread belief.
It's ubiquitous. But instead, we're going to look at the brutal, kind of unglamorous mechanics of how an elite mindset is actually constructed from the ground up.
I love that. Unpacking the actual mechanics.
Oh, yeah. And then we are going to tackle a profound and, well, frankly, terrifying realization that you can build that elite mindset, achieve all the external markers of success, and still end up feeling entirely hollow.
Oh, absolutely. That happens all the time.
Right. So that realization will force us into the second phase of our journey, a deep psychological breakdown of how purpose and meaning are actively manufactured, not magically discovered.
That myth of the success gene is arguably the most destructive story society tells us today.
Without a doubt.
We look at people operating at the absolute peak of their fields. You know, groundbreaking entrepreneurs, world-class musicians, pioneering scientists, and society collectively shrugs and says, well, they're just built differently.
Right, like they have some secret sauce.
Yeah, that they were born with a rare biological disposition for ambition. But what is fascinating here is the psychological utility of that myth.
Wait, what do you mean by utility? Like, how is it useful?
Well, it acts as a massive collective ego defense mechanism.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. If we culturally agree that elite performance is the result of a genetic lottery, it completely absolves the rest of us of the responsibility to push through our own limitations.
It lets us off the hook?
Just so.
Yeah.
If success is baked into someone's DNA, then my failure to master a new language or launch a business is not a result of my own lack of perseverance. It is simply because I lacked the correct genetic sequence.
Wow, yeah. It is a deeply comforting narrative because it provides immediate psychological safety. But let me jump in and challenge that premise right away.
Go for it.
Are we seriously suggesting that raw, inborn talent plays no role whatsoever? Because, I mean, if you were listening to this right now, you can probably think of someone in your high school who barely studied and aced every mathematics exam.
Oh, sure. The kid who just gets it.
Right. Or someone who picked up a guitar and just inherently understood rhythm. We cannot deny that cognitive baselines and physical attributes exist. Surely, life deals some people a hand of 4 aces right out of the gate.
We must be highly accurate about what biological advantages actually look like. Let us move away from the 4 aces analogy, though.
Okay, why is that?
Because life is not a static game of cards. It is an incredibly dynamic, evolving biological process. Yes, baseline variations exist. Some individuals are born with a slightly more efficient dopamine reuptake system,
or like a higher density of fast-twitch muscle fibers for athletes.
Well, accurately speaking, yes. Or a neural architecture that allows for slightly faster pattern recognition in mathematics. However, a cognitive baseline is strictly a foundation.
Just the foundation.
Right. It is the raw dirt upon which a structure might be built. What the data consistently reveals is that individuals with average cognitive baselines who develop highly specific, resilient cognitive habits will categorically outperform individuals with high baseline intelligence who crumble at the first sign of friction.
Wow. So the raw material dictates your starting line, without a doubt.
Yes.
But the constructed mindset dictates the trajectory, the velocity, and the ultimate destination.
That is a perfect way to summarize it.
So if the mindset is the architecture built on top of that baseline, I want to look at the very first brick of that architecture. And to do that, I want to bring up a case study that frankly baffled me when I first read it.
Well, the chef's story.
Yeah, there's this young chef, let's call her Miriam. She is now running a phenomenally successful restaurant, but her early training was a disaster.
But a complete mess, from what I recall.
Yeah, she was not a natural. She was burning intricate French sauces constantly. Now, human nature dictates that when we are bad at something, especially in a competitive environment, we hide it. We want to preserve our status.
Obviously, the ego demands protection.
Right. But Miriam did the complete opposite. She had this incredibly bizarre willingness to be terrible in public.
Which is so rare.
It is. She would deliberately volunteer to cook the dishes she struggled with the most, often in front of unimpressed instructors and paying customers. Why on earth would anyone willingly subject themselves to that level of public professional humiliation?
Because she had achieved a cognitive separation that most people never manage. She separated her identity from her performance.
Separated her identity from her performance. Okay, break that down.
When we observe Miriam's behavior through the lens of psychology, we see a masterclass in emotional regulation. For the average person, identity is tightly entangled with output.
So if I produce bad work, I am a bad person.
Right. If your internal narrative is, I am a competent, intelligent person, and then you burn a sauce, that burned sauce is not just a culinary mistake, it is an existential threat.
An existential threat. So the brain literally panics.
Yes, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, fires up just as it would if you were being chased by a predator. It signals that your status, and therefore your survival, is in jeopardy. But Miriam treated competence not as an inherent trait, but as an external construct she was currently building.
I have always conceptualized this as the difference between getting a tattoo and wearing a heavy winter coat.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, so if you, the listener, tell yourself, I am a terrible public speaker, you have essentially tattooed that limitation onto your ego. It is permanent. It is who you are.
And you carry it everywhere.
Right. Every time you stumble over a sentence in a boardroom, you point to the tattoo and say, see, I knew it. The failure validates the identity.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But if you adopt Miriam's mindset and say, I am someone who is currently working on the mechanics of public speaking, then the lack of skill is just an uncomfortable, heavy coat you are wearing.
It's external.
Yeah, it is burdensome, sure, but it is external to you. You can take it off eventually.
That mechanism of viewing limitations as external and temporary is the cornerstone of neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity being the brain's ability to change.
Specifically, its literal ability to rewire itself in response to new experiences. When a limitation is viewed as a permanent tattoo, the brain does not allocate resources to neuroplastic adaptation. It assumes the case is closed.
Why waste the energy? Right.
Exactly. I mean, just so. But when the limitation is viewed as a temporary coat, the brain remains in a state of high cognitive flexibility. Miriam was able to endure public failure because her core identity was never on the chopping block.
She was just gathering data on temperature control and butter clarification.
Yes, whereas her peers were desperately trying to protect their fragile egos from being bruised.
But wait, if we accept that identity is fluid and failures is just data, that sounds very sterile and logical.
On paper, yes.
Right, but in reality, standing in a hot kitchen with a ruined dish while your mentor glares at you, that hurts. The embarrassment is visceral. It feels terrible. How do these high achievers not just collapse under the sheer exhaustion of constantly managing that emotional pain? We tend to view successful people as fearless robots who somehow don't experience the sting of embarrassment.
Which is a complete mischaracterization of how high performers operate. They experience the exact same flush of cortisol and adrenaline when they fail as you or I do.
Really, they feel the same panic.
Without a doubt. The divergence happens in the millisecond after that chemical flush. This brings us to a phenomenon we can call the discomfort tolerance gap. High achievers do not possess superhuman emotional anesthesia. They simply have a fundamentally different relationship with the biological reality of discomfort.
This connects directly to a phase of adult learning that the research brilliantly calls the messy middle.
Ah, yes. The messy middle.
If you are a listener trying to learn a new coding language or maybe pivot to a new career at 35, you know this phase intimately. It is that brutal stretch where you are just competent enough to know exactly how bad you are.
Which is an agonizing place to be.
Yeah, and you have invested too much time to quit without feeling a profound sense of waste.
The language people use to describe that specific phase is incredibly revealing. When you interview individuals who eventually abandon their pursuits, they describe the messy middle with catastrophic language.
What kind of language?
They say, this is completely hopeless, or I am fundamentally broken, or even the universe is telling me to stop.
Wow, making it huge and cosmic.
Right. They interpret the biological sensation of cognitive strain as a definitive verdict. that they are on the wrong path.
Because it feels hard, it must be wrong.
Yes. Conversely, high performers use strikingly neutral, almost clinical language for the exact same physical and emotional sensation. They label it the messy middle, or they say, this is the friction phase before the breakthrough.
It is a linguistic reframing. They don't romanticize the pain, saying, oh, I love suffering. But they also don't catastrophize it. They just categorize it as standard operating procedure.
It's just part of the process.
Which brings up the story of Theo, a software developer. He spent 2 grueling years building a product that the market completely rejected. 3 different rounds of investor pitches, 3 unequivocal rejections.
That is a massive amount of rejection to swallow.
Huge! Even his friends were staging gentle interventions, suggesting he go back to a safe corporate job. The messy middle stretched into a messy 2 years. How did he not just internalize that rejection and label himself a failure?
Theo relied on a highly specific cognitive firewall. When faced with catastrophic rejection, the default human brain asks a trap question.
A trap question.
Yes, it asks, what does this failure say about me? That question is a direct pipeline to a downward spiral of shame and ego depletion.
Because the answer the brain provides is usually pretty mean.
Very mean. Theo trained himself, and it is a rigorous training process, to be clear, to replace that trap question with a productive question. He asked, what does this failure teach me, specifically about my user interface or my pricing model?
That pivot from what does this say about me to what does this teach me is massive.
It changes the entire cognitive framework.
The first is an identity question that triggers a defensive posture. The second is a data gathering question that treats the 2 years of failure as an incredibly expensive, highly detailed puzzle.
Just a puzzle to be solved.
But honestly, if you tell people, hey, you just need to embrace failure, they roll their eyes. It has become a hollow corporate buzzword. Fail fast, fail often. It ignores the fact that failure genuinely triggers our survival instincts.
The advice to simply be fearless or embrace failure is biologically absurd. The fear of failure is a highly evolved, deeply necessary neurological response.
It kept us alive.
Right. For our ancestors, failing to secure food or failing to navigate tribal politics meant death. The amygdala is designed to keep us safe by avoiding risk. What separates high achievers is not the magical absence of this evolutionary fear. It is the disciplined, repeated refusal to allow that fear to dictate their behavioral choices.
Let's look at the statistics in elite sports because they perfectly illustrate this. If you analyze the careers of the greatest tennis players or the most prolific goal scorers in soccer, they actually accumulate more total misses, more unforced errors, and more lost matches than almost anyone else in their sport.
The sheer volume of their failure is staggering.
Because they are competing at a volume and intensity that makes failure mathematically inevitable. What is fascinating here is how they process that massive volume of defeat without their confidence eroding to zero.
Sports psychologists study this extensively. They use a term called the emotional half-life of setbacks.
Half-life, like in chemistry.
Strictly speaking, in physics, a half-life is the time required for a radioactive substance to lose half of its energy. Applied to elite psychology, it refers to the speed at which a person metabolizes disappointment.
So the disappointment is highly radioactive at first. It burns.
Yes.
But for a champion, that radiation decays incredibly fast. They don't carry the toxic waste of a missed penalty kick into the next game a week later.
They process it and let it decay.
But for the rest of us, the ones who aren't playing professional sports, how do we artificially shorten our own emotional half-life? There is a case study about a small business owner, Devin, who lost an enormous client. It was a devastating financial blow.
A terrifying moment for any business owner.
Right. His immediate, very human instinct was to spiral into severe self-criticism. He wanted to mentally replay the loss for weeks.
To prevent that prolonged radioactive decay, Devin instituted a strict written ritual. Within hours of the catastrophic news, he forced himself to sit down and document 3 categories.
What were they?
Strictly, what went wrong operationally, what variables were entirely outside of his control, and specifically, what protocol would be changed for the next pitch. Now, writing this list did not magically flood his brain with happiness. He was still angry and disappointed.
Obviously, you don't just write a list and smile after losing money.
No, but the ritual acted as a cognitive firewall.
It forced his brain out of the emotional, threat-detecting amygdala and into the logical, problem-solving prefrontal cortex. He reframed the failure as feedback, not a verdict.
A verdict versus feedback. That's a crucial distinction.
Yeah, a verdict is a final sentence handed down by a judge. You're guilty, case closed. Feedback is just raw material for the next iteration. The successful mindset trains itself to ask, what now? Instead of the victim mindset's favorite paralyzing question, why me?
If discomfort tolerance and shortening your emotional half-life are about managing the psychological weight of the present moment, we must now address the temporal weight of the future.
The long game.
Yes. This requires us to examine the concept of playing the long game, which is increasingly difficult in our current neurological environment.
Oh, it is nearly impossible today. I mean, if you were listening to this on a smartphone, you are holding a device engineered by thousands of the smartest behavioral scientists on Earth to destroy your capacity for delayed gratification.
It is a constant battle for our dopamine.
We have instant food delivery, instant streaming, instant algorithmic validation on social media. We are swimming in cheap dopamine. So to actually commit to a goal that will not yield a single drop of validation for years feels completely unnatural. It feels like swimming up a waterfall.
It requires a deliberate downregulation of your brain's dopamine expectations. Take the case study of Priya, an aspiring novelist.
Okay, Priya.
She spent 6 years writing manuscripts that never saw the light of day. For 6 long years, she had to navigate a world where her peers were hitting highly visible societal milestones, buying homes, securing corporate promotions, posting vacation photos.
And society immediately rewards those external markers with intense validation. Likes, comments, congratulations.
Meanwhile, her daily reality was invisible. She was sitting alone in a room, generating thousands of words that largely went into the digital trash bin. She had absolutely zero guarantee that the market would ever reward her effort.
So if you are Priya, how do you prevent the sheer temporal weight of those 6 years from crushing your resolve? How do you keep going when every societal signal is screaming that you are falling hopelessly behind?
Priya survived that temporal wasteland through a severe adjustment of her internal benchmarking. If she had measured her progress against the external timelines of her peers, the cognitive dissonance would have destroyed her motivation.
She would have just quit.
Without a doubt. Instead, she restricted her benchmarking strictly to her own past performance. She evaluated her sentence structure today against her sentence structure 6 months prior. This ability to sustain focused effort over a long horizon, devoid of immediate external reward, is the operational definition of grit.
Grit. It is a concept that dominates self-improvement literature, sometimes to the point of cliché, honestly.
It really is everywhere.
But the core mechanism is undeniable. It is the endurance of effort, independent of applause. However, I want to push back here because this is where a lot of people get trapped.
Okay, how so?
How do you, as a listener, know the difference between demonstrating grit by playing the long game and just stubbornly, foolishly continuing to do something that is objectively failing? Because people waste decades being gritty on dead-end projects.
That is the critical vulnerability of grit, and it reveals why grit in isolation is actually dangerous. If you are merely stubborn, you are operating from a posture of rigid certainty. You are plugging your ears and ignoring market feedback, believing your sheer force of will can bend reality.
Which is delusional.
Highly delusional. What prevents high achievers from becoming blindly stubborn is that they pair their grit with a relentless, almost aggressive curiosity. They're unusually comfortable with being wrong. They treat their own deeply held convictions as entirely provisional.
Provisional, meaning temporary and subject to immediate revision the moment better data arrives.
Yes.
And this goes against every natural human instinct, specifically confirmation bias. We are hardwired to furiously seek out evidence that proves we are right and to conveniently ignore or discredit any data that suggests we are wrong.
Confirmation bias is incredibly energy efficient for the brain. It eliminates cognitive dissonance. It feels warm and safe to be surrounded by information that validates your pre-existing worldview.
But it is also the mechanism that keeps failing businesses open for 5 years too long.
Exactly, or rather, accurately speaking. If we analyze highly successful financial investors, their behavior is completely counterintuitive. You would assume they surround themselves with analysts who confirm their brilliant market predictions.
But the truly elite investors do the complete opposite. Before they commit capital to a major position, they institute a formal process of seeking out the most articulate, intelligent arguments against their own thesis. They actively incentivize their teams to destroy their logic.
Because their operating philosophy is that a strategy that survives rigorous hostile scrutiny is infinitely more robust than a strategy born in an echo chamber. And this curiosity-driven framework extends beyond corporate strategy into how these individuals process personal criticism.
Right. When someone criticizes us, our default biological setting is to cross our arms, elevate our heart rate, and prepare a defense. We view criticism as a physical attack.
The amygdala responds again.
Yeah. But people who have constructed this elite mindset utilize a very disarming, powerful question when faced with critique. They stop, regulate their breathing, and ask themselves, is there something true in this that I should pay attention to?
We must qualify this carefully, though. This does not mean you must absorb every piece of toxic feedback or bad faith criticism thrown at you. A significant portion of criticism is just projection from unhappy people.
Sure, some of it is just noise.
However, maintaining a reflexive openness, the willingness to briefly lower your shields and investigate whether the critique contains a valuable grain of truth, prevents you from calcifying into stubbornness. It ensures your grit is pointed in the correct direction.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have discussed a massive array of cognitive heavy lifting so far, separating identity from performance, reframing the amygdala's threat response to failure, artificially shortening your emotional half-life, overriding instant gratification, and fighting confirmation bias.
That is a staggering amount of mental energy being deployed.
Right. Running all of these mental algorithms simultaneously requires so much energy. You cannot power this kind of psychological machinery on fumes. There has to be a reactor core driving it all, which brings us to the foundational, the critical anchor of intrinsic motivation.
Without that intrinsic anchor, the entire constructed mindset eventually undergoes a catastrophic structural failure. This exposes the fatal flaw of relying on extrinsic motivation.
External rewards, like money or status.
Yes. If your behavioral reactor core is fueled exclusively by external rewards, chasing a higher salary, accumulating job titles, or seeking prestige to impress your peers, that fuel source is highly volatile. The moment a macroeconomic shift stalls your promotion or a competitor steals your market share, your motivation entirely evaporates because the external reward is gone.
We see the reality of this in the story of Aisha, a highly driven social worker. For the first few years of her career, she was remarkably successful, but she admitted her drive was largely extrinsic. She loved the praise from her directors, she was obsessed with climbing the administrative ladder, and she thrived on the prestige of rapid promotions.
This is very common.
But then, a change in government policy resulted in severe budget cuts to her department. Promotions were frozen indefinitely.
And because her entire psychological architecture was built on the expectation of those external promotions, her drive collapsed. She experienced profound burnout and clinical exhaustion. She could not force herself to care about the daily tasks anymore.
She hit a wall.
A massive wall. Her recovery, her ability to rebuild her success mindset, only occurred when she engaged in the agonizingly difficult work of reconnecting with her intrinsic baseline. She had to unearth her original, uncorrupted reason for entering social work in the first place.
Which was a deeply held personal value system centered on helping marginalized individuals navigate systemic crises. And what is vital to note is that her external environment did not improve. The budgets remained frozen, the promotions were still gone.
But her resilience returned, because her reactor core was now running on a renewable internal fuel source rather than a fragile external one.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, so I just need to find my why, and then I will have the infinite willpower to wake up at 5 a.m. and conquer the world. There is this massive cultural assumption that successful people possess a superhuman reserve of willpower.
The scientific literature on ego depletion and habit formation completely dismantles the myth of superhuman willpower. Willpower is not a character trait. It is a severely limited, exhaustible cognitive resource.
Like a battery that drains throughout the day.
Just so. If you spend the first 3 hours of your day using sheer willpower to resist checking your phone, arguing with yourself about going to the gym, and forcing yourself to focus on a spreadsheet, your willpower reservoir is empty by noon. High performers understand this biological limitation profoundly. Therefore, they actually rely on willpower significantly less than the average person.
That sounds like a paradox. How do you achieve more by using less discipline? The answer is that they become obsessive architects of their environments. They ruthlessly eliminate friction points.
Environmental engineering.
Yeah. Take the example of a prolific author. We imagine they sit at their desk and summon a magical muse through pure artistic discipline. In reality, they rely on ironclad, unglamorous environmental engineering. The writer uses the exact same chair every single morning, brews the same type of coffee, shuts the door to create a physical boundary, and physically removes their smartphone to a different floor of the house.
By engineering the environment, she has outsourced the discipline to the room itself. She's removed the need to make a decision. She does not have to debate whether she feels motivated to write. The physical cues of the room trigger a preconditioned neurological sequence that makes starting almost automatic.
We see this principle everywhere. The classic example of laying out your running shoes and gym clothes at the foot of your bed the night before. It sounds trivial, but at 6 a.m., when your willpower is non-existent, the tiny friction point of having to search in the dark for clean socks is enough cognitive load to make you abandon the entire workout.
It absolutely is.
By removing that friction, you preserve your limited willpower for the actual physical exertion.
These microscopic environmental adjustments do not make for inspiring social media content. They're incredibly mundane. Yet the compounding effect of these friction-reducing habits is what truly separates sustained high performance from erratic bursts of motivation. You are not trying to be a better person. You are trying to design a day where being a productive person requires the least amount of cognitive effort possible.
And critically, they do not build these environments in a vacuum. We cannot discuss the construction of a high-achieving mindset without examining the immense gravitational pull of community and mentorship. There is a well-known psychological observation that you unconsciously calibrate your baseline of acceptable behavior to the 5 or 6 people you interact with most frequently.
This phenomena is driven by our mirror neurons and our deep evolutionary need for social belonging. Your peer group establishes an invisible, highly potent ceiling on your ambition.
A ceiling.
Yes. If you are embedded in a social circle where a minimal effort, clock-punching mentality is celebrated as the ultimate victory over the system, your brain will unconsciously adopt that as its standard. You will feel psychological friction if you try to exceed that ceiling, because outperforming your tribe triggers a subtle fear of social ostracization.
You don't want to be kicked out of the group. The story of Kofi, a young architect, demonstrates how to actively manipulate this social contagion. He applied to join a highly prestigious, fiercely competitive design cohort specifically because he knew he was completely unqualified to be in the room. He actively sought out an environment where he would be the least experienced, least talented person at the table.
By immersing himself in that elevated ecosystem, Kofi subjected himself to a radical recalibration of his cognitive baseline. When he observed his peers routinely tearing up their third drafts and working late into the night, not out of panic, but out of a genuine obsession with craft, his internal definition of normal effort shifted permanently. Mentorship operates on a similar, but more concentrated frequency.
We often think a mentor is there to just give us a list of technical shortcuts, but their real value is psychological. When you are drowning in the messy middle, feeling entirely hopeless, a mentor provides living, breathing, biological proof that the agonizing path you're on actually leads to a tangible destination. They are a proxy for hope when your own supply is depleted.
Accurately speaking, they serve as a regulatory mechanism for your anxiety. They can look at your catastrophic failure, shrug, and say, yes, that happened to me in year 3. It's a necessary phase. That external validation of your struggle prevents you from abandoning the process.
So what does this all mean? It means that a high-achieving mindset is a grueling daily practice, not a permanent destination. You don't just achieve a state of success, mindset, and retire.
No, it requires constant upkeep.
The chef who learned to fail in public still feels the sting of a bad review. The software developer still has mornings where he doubts his competence. Mindset is exactly like cardiovascular fitness. It demands relentless daily maintenance, and the moment you stop running the algorithms of reframing and discomfort tolerance, the mindset begins to atrophy.
That realization should be deeply empowering for our listeners. It demystifies greatness. The tools we have discussed, externalizing failure, utilizing productive questions, artificially shortening your emotional half-life, engineering friction-free environments, and auditing your peer group are not locked behind a genetic paywall. They are cognitive behavioral tools available for immediate deployment by anyone willing to tolerate the initial discomfort of using them.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the pivot point of our entire deep dive today. We talked about Aisha, the social worker, who realized that all this incredible mental toughness, all this resilience and grit is completely useless if your reactor core is fueled by the wrong things.
It just leads to burnout.
Right. She needed a deep, intrinsic why. But that begs the ultimate question. How do we actually get that why? If you are listening to this on your commute, looking out the window and feeling completely disconnected from your job, How do you find your purpose? For decades, the self-help industry has aggressively sold us the narrative that we just need to go out into the world and search for our singular, magical calling.
The myth of the grand calling, or the big reveal, is perhaps the only narrative more damaging than the myth of the success gene. The cultural story dictates that somewhere out in the universe, hidden in a dramatic career pivot, a relocation to a foreign country, or an expensive spiritual retreat in the mountains, there exists a single, predestined answer to the question of your existence.
Like it's hiding under a rock somewhere.
Yes, and the myth seductively promises that the moment you stumble upon this calling, the clouds will part, all confusion will evaporate, and you will exist in a state of perpetual, frictionless motivation.
It is an incredibly dangerous fairy tale because it turns us into passive consumers waiting for enlightenment to be delivered. I'm thinking of Martin, the accountant in Manchester. His story is agonizingly common. He spent the entirety of his 30s convinced that he was just residing in the waiting room of his own life.
The waiting room. That is such a tragic phrase.
He genuinely believed that his real life, the meaningful one, was scheduled to begin at some unspecified future date.
Martin is the quintessential victim of the big reveal myth. He completely outsourced his agency to a hypothetical future. He devoured books on finding purpose. He flirted endlessly with the idea of moving to a new continent. He constantly drafted plans for radical life overhauls.
But he never executed them?
No. He was paralyzed because no single option felt like the absolute guaranteed calling. And so while he was busy scanning the horizon for a grand destiny, the actual tangible substance of his life slipped away unlived.
Because he fundamentally misunderstood the physics of meaning. He thought purpose was a buried treasure you find with a map. But if we look at the darkest, most extreme testing grounds of human psychology, we see that meaning is actually a muscle that is forged under pressure. The observations of Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the unimaginable horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, absolutely destroy the modern, privileged concept of finding your passion.
Frankl's work is the bedrock of this discussion. In an environment specifically engineered to strip human beings of every conceivable external marker of identity and dignity, Frankl observed a profound psychological phenomenon. The individuals who maintained their psychological integrity were not the ones idly waiting for liberation.
They weren't just hoping for the future.
No, nor were they waiting to discover a grand philosophical calling. They were the ones who forcefully manufactured highly practical, immediate, microscopic reasons to endure the suffering of the next 60 minutes.
It strips the concept of purpose right down to its raw biological necessity. For one prisoner, purpose was the commitment to physically memorize the manuscript he was writing so he could publish it after the war. For another, it was the sheer biological imperative to survive long enough to embrace their child again. In a survival situation, purpose is not a luxury good. It is the psychological oxygen required to take the next breath.
And if meaning is that vital, that structurally necessary in the abyss of a concentration camp, we must apply that reality to the chaotic, mundane reality of our daily lives. Purpose is not waiting for you on a mountaintop. It is constructed, brick by agonizing brick, in the texture of an ordinary Wednesday afternoon.
An ordinary Wednesday afternoon.
Yes. To understand how to build it, we must first dismantle the fuzzy, esoteric buzzwords surrounding it and look at the clinical definition. In the field of positive psychology, a meaningful life is generally broken down into three distinct measurable components. The first is coherence.
Coherence. This is the cognitive sense that your life possesses a logical narrative structure. It is the ability to look backward and trace a recognizable thread through the seemingly random chaos of your past choices. It doesn't mean you are fulfilling a cosmic prophecy, it just means recognizing patterns.
Finding the thread.
Right. Saying, even when I was a kid, I was always the one mediating arguments. Or looking back at my weird career path, the common denominator has always been my obsession with streamlining messy systems. It is making sense of the data.
Accurately stated, you are organizing the chaos of your history into a legible narrative. The second component is purpose, which researchers use here in a very specific, narrow sense. This is the forward-facing vector of meaning.
The direction you're heading.
Yes, it requires having defined, intentional goals and a trajectory. It is the psychological comfort of knowing that the difficult, tedious actions you are taking today are incrementally contributing to a future state that aligns with your values.
And then we arrive at the third component, which the data suggests is the most critically underrated piece of the puzzle: Significance. This is the deeply rooted, intrinsic conviction that your existence possesses inherent worth and value, completely divorced from your economic output or your visible achievements. This is the component that our hyper-capitalist, achievement-obsessed culture actively attempts to crush.
We are conditioned against it.
We are indoctrinated to believe that our significance is directly proportional to our productivity.
That decoupling of significance from productivity is a massive psychological hurdle. And it brings us to a crucial distinction that trips up millions of people: the conflation of a meaningful life with a happy life. We must separate hedonic well-being, the pursuit of immediate pleasure and the avoidance of pain, from eudaimonic well-being, which is the pursuit of meaning and self-actualization. They operate on entirely different neurological pathways.
This is such a critical distinction. If you ask a listener, do you want a happy life or a meaningful one? They usually assume they are the same thing. But the classic sociological example shatters this illusion. The parent awake at 3 a.m., pacing the hallway with a screaming, feverish toddler.
Yes. The 3.0 a.m. parent.
If you ask that parent in that exact moment, are you experiencing happiness? The answer is a resounding no. They are exhausted, their cortisol levels are spiking, they are deeply anxious, and they are experiencing zero pleasure.
They are biologically miserable. However, if you interview that same parent a week later and ask, was that agonizing night meaningful? Did it possess significance? The answer is an emphatic, unequivocal yes.
It meant everything to them.
Right. We constantly trap ourselves on the hedonic treadmill, believing that if we just accumulate enough pleasurable weekends, we will eventually build a meaningful life. But you can spend an entire year optimizing for pleasure eating at the best restaurants, avoiding all conflict, binge-watching entertainment, and arrive at the end of December feeling an overwhelming, terrifying sense of psychological emptiness.
Because pleasure evaporates the moment the stimulus is removed, but meaning accumulates over time, often through the very friction and discomfort we try to avoid. You can have a brutal week at work, having a difficult but necessary conversation with a failing employee, pushing a highly complex project over the finish line, caring for a sick relative, and you finish that week physically depleted, but possessing a profound, heavy sense of eudaimonic fullness.
This leads us directly into another cognitive trap: the paralysis of scale. Because we confuse meaning with grand societal impact, we develop the toxic belief that unless our actions are fundamentally altering the course of human history, they are meaningless.
It's all or nothing.
Just so, if we are not curing a rare disease, legislating massive political reform, or writing a generational masterpiece, we conclude that our mundane daily existence lacks purpose.
This paralysis of scale destroys so much potential. Let's look at Aisha, a high school teacher in Toronto. For a decade, she suffered from a low-grade chronic professional depression. Why? Because she was constantly comparing her administrative, unglamorous reality to the highlight reels of her university friends who had gone on to work in international medicine or high-profile environmental NGOs.
Their work was so visible.
Their careers had a built-in, billboard-sized sense of mission.
While they were ostensibly saving the world, Aisha was drowning in a sea of standardized testing forms, managing the chaotic hormones of 14-year-olds, and fighting with the school board over paper allocations. Her daily reality felt small, invisible, and entirely disconnected from any grand narrative of purpose.
Until years later, she receives an unexpected email. It is from a former student, a kid who had grown up in a highly unstable environment. He was writing to inform her that he had just become the first person in his entire extended family to be accepted into a university.
What a moment for a teacher.
Incredible. But he reached out specifically to tell her why. He recalled a completely mundane Tuesday afternoon where she had kept him after class, looked him directly in the eye, and told him that his rough draft of an essay demonstrated a unique, insightful way of looking at the world. He told her that passing comment was the first time in his life an adult had ever signaled that he possessed intellectual worth.
We must analyze the mechanics of that moment. Aisha was not operating under a grand, strategic 5-year plan to alter the socioeconomic trajectory of that student's family lineage. She was simply executing her daily job. The psychological breakthrough here is that meaning does not reside in the global scale of the action. It resides entirely in the quality of attention brought to the action. Aisha brought a moment of deliberate, unfragmented presence to an interaction with a struggling teenager.
That is incredibly liberating for the listener. You do not need to quit your corporate job and move to a developing nation to manufacture meaning. You simply have to radically increase the quality of attention you bring to the interactions you are already having.
It is entirely within your control.
A conversation held with genuine, undivided presence creates ripples in the social fabric that you will likely never be allowed to measure. But there is a massive behavioral obstacle that prevents us from doing this, which is our flawed understanding of motivation.
The sequence trap. We operate under the delusion that we are highly rational creatures who first experience a surge of emotional motivation, and then riding that wave of inspiration, we take action. We think, once I feel a deep, burning passion for community service, I will start volunteering.
We wait for the feeling to arrive before we change the behavior. And this brings up Daniel, the software developer. Daniel conceptually wanted to be a person who gave back to his community. He identified a local urban garden project.
A great initiative.
But every Saturday morning for 6 months, he would wake up, run an internal diagnostic check on his emotional state, determine that he lacked the requisite motivation, and decide to stay on his couch. He was waiting for the emotional weather to change.
And if left to his own devices, he would have waited until his deathbed. His behavioral pattern only broke because of external social pressure. A friend essentially forced him to attend a volunteer shift. Daniel arrived at the community garden resentful, entirely devoid of enthusiasm, and biologically resistant to the task.
He was literally dragged there. But then the mechanics of behavioral psychology took over. After 20 minutes of physically engaging with the environment, kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, and engaging in awkward but genuine conversation with an 80-year-old fellow volunteer, a profound shift occurred. His neurological state completely altered.
The brain chemistry caught up.
The motivation, the sense of connection, the feeling of purpose, it all flooded in. But it arrived after he had initiated the physical action.
This perfectly illustrates the concept of post hoc rationalization and behavioral activation. The human brain is an incredibly efficient, meaning-making machine, but it often operates in reverse. We frequently engage in an action, sometimes purely out of obligation, routine, or peer pressure, and our brain, observing our physical behavior, retroactively generates the emotions and the narrative to justify what we are doing.
Action precedes motivation.
Without a doubt. It is the friction of doing the work that generates the heat of inspiration.
If you are listening and feeling stuck, this is the master key. If you sit in your apartment waiting to feel a profound sense of purpose before you reach out to a lonely friend or before you start that creative project, you will wait forever. You must force the physical action first. Send the text message, sign up for the terrible beginners class, show up at the meeting, act in a low-stakes, highly mechanical way, and allow your brain's chemistry to catch up to your body's behavior.
And when we speak of reaching out to a lonely friend, we intersect with the most robust, statistically undeniable finding in the entire history of psychological research regarding human well-being.
This is the big one.
Yes. If you aggregate decades of longitudinal data, controlling for socioeconomic status, geography, and physical health, the single most powerful predictor of a meaningful life is the depth and quality of your relationship.
Which, frankly, can feel almost disappointing in its simplicity. We live in a hyper-individualistic culture that worships the self-made pioneer. We want the secret to a meaningful life to be something incredibly complex that we achieve entirely on our own, perhaps through an intense meditation retreat or a brilliant business acquisition.
We want a life hack.
Right. But the data refuses to budge. It always, inevitably, comes back to our neurobiological need for connection.
It is an unavoidable biological reality.
Wow.
However, we must introduce a vital taxonomy here. Not all relationships generate meaning. We must strictly differentiate between transactional relationships and transformational relationships.
Okay, lay out the difference.
A transactional relationship is the bedrock of societal function. It is a mutual exchange of utility. I provide you with a service, you provide me with compensation. I help you move your furniture, you buy me dinner. Both parties extract what they require, and the fundamental identity of neither party is altered.
Transactional relationships are necessary, but they are emotionally shallow. Transformational relationships, conversely, are profoundly dangerous to the ego because the connection itself possesses the power to rewrite your identity. Being truly deeply known by another human being with all your flaws, your hypocrisies, and your fears fully exposed alters your cognitive baseline. These are the relationships that tether us to reality and provide the deepest reservoir of meaning.
The cultivation of these transformational bonds requires immense temporal and emotional investment. It requires the deliberate choice to embrace inconvenience. Choosing to show up at a hospital room during a week when you are drowning in professional obligations simply to sit in silence with a grieving friend will generate more lasting eudaimonic meaning than securing a promotion.
Alongside the profound meaning generated by relationships, there is another deeply fulfilling pathway we must explore. It involves the intersection of contribution and craft. Psychologists use a brilliant term for this: generativity. It was coined by the developmental psychologist Erik Erikson, and it describes the innate, powerful human drive to create, nurture, or build things that will fundamentally outlast our own biological existence.
Generativity is the ultimate rebellion against our own mortality. It traditionally manifests in raising children or mentoring the next generation of professionals, but it also expresses itself in remarkably humble, localized actions. The case study of Hank, the retired carpenter, provides a perfect illustration of generativity divorced from ego.
Hank spends his entire weekend, every weekend, in a dusty garage meticulously repairing salvaged, broken bicycles. He then quietly donates these restored bikes to underfunded community centers for children he will never interact with. He receives zero public recognition. His name is not on a plaque. The children riding the bikes do not know he exists.
Hank is tapping directly into the neurochemistry of generativity. By taking raw, broken materials and imposing order and utility upon them, he is leaving a microscopic but tangible imprint on the future. And critically, while engaging in this deeply physical, methodical work, Hank is likely accessing a highly sought-after psychological state known as flow.
Flow state. It is that magical cognitive zone where time seems to warp, self-consciousness entirely evaporates, and you are completely, obsessively absorbed in the present moment. But flow isn't just random. It has specific mechanical triggers, doesn't it?
Strictly speaking, flow requires a highly specific environmental balance. It occurs when a task perfectly matches your skill level while slightly stretching your capacity. The task must demand your absolute undivided attention to succeed, but it cannot be so overwhelmingly difficult that it triggers the amygdala's frustration and threat response.
When you enter that flow state, you bring a level of genuine, almost spiritual craftsmanship to the task. And this is the secret. You can apply craftsmanship to anything. You can experience flow while writing a complex algorithm, but you can also experience it while painstakingly organizing a messy bookshelf, pruning a garden, or dicing onions for a highly complex meal. When you bring intense, deliberate care to a mundane task, you transform it into a micro-contribution, meaning hides in the silent gap between simply executing a chore and executing it with profound reverence for the process.
Now, we are approaching a juncture in our analysis that is deeply uncomfortable, but it would be intellectual malpractice to avoid it. If we're honestly mapping how meaning is constructed, we must acknowledge that some of our most profound, structurally sound pillars of purpose are forged in the fires of agonizing, uninvited trauma.
We have to tread incredibly carefully here. I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment. We are not, under any circumstances, romanticizing suffering. The cultural narrative that everything happens for a reason can be incredibly toxic when applied to senseless tragedy. Sometimes a terminal illness, a catastrophic financial ruin, or the loss of a loved one is just horrific, senseless pain with no silver lining whatsoever. We must validate that reality. However, we also have to acknowledge the scientifically documented phenomenon of post-traumatic growth.
Post-traumatic growth is a complex, often agonizing psychological evolution. When an individual's life is violently disassembled by a crisis, their foundational assumptions about the world are destroyed. But in the long, brutal aftermath of that destruction, survivors sometimes engage in a radical psychological audit.
They reevaluate everything.
Yes. They're forced to evaluate what actually matters when the superficial structures of their lives are burned away.
Priya's experience with a devastating divorce is a prime example. In the immediate aftermath, she experienced complete structural collapse. Her social circles fractured, her financial stability vanished, and her envisioned future evaporated. She was in profound pain. But when she was interviewed nearly 2 years later, she articulated something startling. She said she felt more authentically herself than she had in a decade.
Because the trauma acted as a brutal, involuntary clarifying agent. Before the collapse, Priya's life was heavily burdened by borrowed ambitions. Career goals she adopted to impress her parents, social obligations she maintained to project a specific image. The collapse forced her to strip away every single inessential element of her identity. What remained was only the bedrock. Again, surviving a trauma does not mean returning to the person you were before the event. It almost always necessitates the construction of a more deliberate, fiercely protective, and highly clarified version of yourself.
So, we have traversed the heights of grand purpose and the depths of post-traumatic growth. But let us bring this massive philosophical discussion crashing back down to earth, right into your living room. If meaning is a structure we build, how do we practically mix the cement and lay the bricks on a random, exhausting Tuesday evening when we just want to watch television? The psychological literature highlights 4 highly specific, unglamorous daily rituals.
These rituals are the micromechanics of meaning. The first ritual is values clarification.
Values clarification.
Right. This is not a vague thought experiment. It is a highly tactical 10-minute daily audit. It requires sitting in absolute silence and asking yourself, what principles actually govern my choices today? We are heavily incentivized to adopt the values of our corporate environments or our social media feeds. If you do not actively, forcefully clarify your intrinsic values daily, you will unconsciously drift into living someone else's life.
It is setting the psychological anchor so the current of modern life doesn't sweep you out to sea. The second ritual is micro-contribution. We discussed the paralysis of scale earlier. This ritual is the antidote. You stop waiting for the opportunity to launch a massive charity, and instead you look for a 2-minute window to inject utility into your existing routine. You spend an extra 3 minutes cleaning the communal coffee machine at the office, or you leave an intensely specific, encouraging comment on a struggling creator's work instead of just scrolling past.
You are intentionally triggering the neurochemistry of generativity through habit stacking. The third ritual is perhaps the most neurologically powerful, reflection at day's end.
Reflection, okay.
This involves taking 3 minutes before sleep to mentally scan the previous 16 hours and specifically isolate the moments where you felt most engaged, useful, or challenged.
Why is that specific timing so important? Because it sounds a bit like just keeping a gratitude journal, which people often dismiss as too simplistic.
It is far more mechanical than a gratitude journal. You are literally reprogramming your reticular activating system, or RAS. The RAS is a bundle of nerves at our brainstem that filters the roughly 11 million bits of sensory information we encounter every second down to the 50 bits our conscious mind can process. By repeatedly forcing your brain to search your memory for moments of meaning right before sleep, you are instructing the RAS that meaning is a highly prioritized data point. Over weeks and months, your RAS will adapt, and it will begin to spontaneously highlight meaningful interactions in real time during your day rather than filtering them out as background noise.
You are literally hacking your brain's hardware to perceive a richer reality. That is incredible. And that leads us to the fourth and final ritual, which is the absolute prerequisite for the other 3, deliberate presence. I know if you were listening on a crowded train, checking your inbox, the idea of presence sounds like a luxury you cannot afford.
It is not a luxury. It is the fundamental raw material of consciousness. We exist in a ruthless attention economy. Trillions of dollars are spent by algorithms designed specifically to fragment your consciousness and commodify your distraction. When you deliberately put your smartphone in another room to listen to your partner speak, or when you close 30 browser tabs to focus exclusively on drafting one email, you're engaging in an act of cognitive rebellion.
Deliberate presence is the refusal to let your life be lived in the margins of your screen time. If you are perpetually distracted, your transformational relationships will wither into transactional ones, your flow states will shatter, and your evening reflection will yield nothing but a blur of notifications.
These 4 rituals, clarifying your anchor, stacking micro-contributions, programming your reticular activating system through reflection, and fiercely guarding your attention are not glamorous. They will never go viral. But they are the exact, verifiable biological and psychological breaks with which an elite mindset and a profoundly meaningful life are actually constructed.
Which brings us to the end of our immense journey today. We have dismantled the myths. We have discovered that the answers to life's biggest questions share the exact same structural blueprint. Elite success and profound purpose are never found lying dormant in your DNA, nor are they waiting for you on a distant mountaintop. They demand the courage to separate your identity from your failures, the grit to endure the invisible messy middle, the humility to remain provisional in your beliefs, and the willingness to take deliberate physical action long before the comforting feeling of motivation ever arrives.
We have covered extraordinary ground today. And if we accept that purpose and success are not mysterious lottery tickets you are missing, but rather structures you are actively building at this very second, it leaves us with one unavoidable question. What is one microscopic, fiercely honest choice you can make today, perhaps in the next 10 minutes, that would add a single solid brick to that foundation?
The brilliant, necessary question to let echo in your mind long after the audio stops. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the architecture of the human mind. If this exploration brought you value, please like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel, and we will see you next time as we continue to stay curious, challenge our assumptions, and keep learning together. Her envisioned future evaporated. She was in profound pain. But when she was interviewed nearly 2 years later, she articulated something startling. She said she felt more authentically herself than she had in a decade.
Because the trauma acted as a brutal, involuntary clarifying agent. Before the collapse, Priya's life was heavily burdened by borrowed ambitions. Career goals she adopted to impress her parents, social obligations she maintained to project a specific image. The collapse forced her to strip away every single inessential element of her identity. What remained was only the bedrock. Again, surviving a trauma does not mean returning to the person you were before the event. It almost always necessitates the construction of a more deliberate, fiercely protective, and highly clarified version of yourself.
So, we have traversed the heights of grand purpose and the depths of post-traumatic growth, but let us bring this massive philosophical discussion crashing back down to earth right into your living room. If meaning is a structure we build, how do we practically mix the cement and lay the bricks on a random, exhausting Tuesday evening when we just want to watch television? The psychological literature highlights 4 highly specific, unglamorous daily rituals.
These rituals are the micromechanics of meaning. The first ritual is values clarification.
That was clarification.
Right. This is not a vague thought experiment. It is a highly tactical 10-minute daily audit. It requires sitting in absolute silence and asking yourself, what principles actually govern my choices today? We are heavily incentivized to adopt the values of our corporate environments or our social media feeds. If you do not actively, forcefully clarify your intrinsic values daily, you will unconsciously drift into living someone else's life.
It is setting the psychological anchor so the current of modern life doesn't sweep you out to sea. The second ritual is micro-contribution. We discussed the paralysis of scale earlier. This ritual is the antidote. You stop waiting for the opportunity to launch a massive charity, and instead, you look for a 2-minute window to inject utility into your existing routine. You spend an extra 3 minutes cleaning the communal coffee machine at the office, or you leave an intensely specific, encouraging comment on a struggling creator's work instead of just scrolling past.
You are intentionally triggering the neurochemistry of generativity through habit stacking. The third ritual is perhaps the most neurologically powerful, reflection at day's end.
Reflection, okay.
This involves taking 3 minutes before sleep to mentally scan the previous 16 hours, and specifically isolate the moments where you felt most engaged, useful, or challenged.
Why is that specific timing so important? Because it sounds a bit like just keeping a gratitude journal, which people often dismiss as too simplistic.
It is far more mechanical than a gratitude journal. You are literally reprogramming your reticular activating system, or RAS. The RAS is a bundle of nerves at our brainstem that filters the roughly 11 million bits of sensory information we encounter every second down to the 50 bits our conscious mind can process. By repeatedly forcing your brain to search your memory for moments of meaning right before sleep, you are instructing the RAS that meaning is a highly prioritized data point. Over weeks and months, your RAS will adapt, and it will begin to spontaneously highlight meaningful interactions in real time during your day rather than filtering them out as background noise.
You are literally hacking your brain's hardware to perceive a richer reality. That is incredible. And that leads us to the fourth and final ritual, which is the absolute prerequisite for the other 3, deliberate presence. I know if you were listening on a crowded train, checking your inbox, the idea of presence sounds like a luxury you cannot afford.
It is not a luxury. It is the fundamental raw material of consciousness. We exist in a ruthless attention economy. Trillions of dollars are spent by algorithms designed specifically to fragment your consciousness and commodify your distraction. When you deliberately put your smartphone in another room to listen to your partner speak, or when you close 30 browser tabs to focus exclusively on drafting one email, you're engaging in an act of cognitive rebellion.
Deliberate presence is the refusal to let your life be lived in the margins of your screen time. If you are perpetually distracted, your transformational relationships will wither into transactional ones, your flow states will shatter, and your evening reflection will yield nothing but a blur of notifications.
These 4 rituals, clarifying your anchor, stacking micro-contributions, programming your reticular activating system through reflection, and fiercely guarding your attention are not glamorous. They will never go viral. But they are the exact, verifiable biological and psychological breaks with which an elite mindset and a profoundly meaningful life are actually constructed.
Which brings us to the end of our immense journey today. We have dismantled the myths. We have discovered that the answers to life's biggest questions share the exact same structural blueprint. Elite success and profound purpose are never found lying dormant in your DNA, nor are they waiting for you on a distant mountaintop. They demand the courage to separate your identity from your failures, the grit to endure the invisible messy middle, the humility to remain provisional in your beliefs, and the willingness to take deliberate physical action long before the comforting feeling of motivation ever arrives.
We have covered extraordinary ground today. And if we accept that purpose and success are not mysterious lottery tickets you are missing, but rather structures you are actively building at this very second, it leaves us with one unavoidable question. What is one microscopic, fiercely honest choice you can make today, perhaps in the next 10 minutes, that would add a single solid brick to that foundation?
The brilliant, necessary question to let echo in your mind long after the audio stops. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the architecture of the human mind. If this exploration brought you value, please like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel, and we will see you next time as we continue to stay curious, challenge our assumptions, and keep learning together.